Before we get into examples of factoring some quadratic expressions, let's go ahead and go over the steps that we're going to use. So when I'm talking about factoring a quadratic, we're starting with ax squared plus bx plus c, which you should recognize as our standard form of a quadratic. We're going to use those numbers and set up an X puzzle. You should have seen these in Algebra 1 and recall that our X puzzle uses a times c in the top and b in the bottom. We're going to try to determine factors to make our X puzzle true, and I'll call those factors m and n. M and n have to multiply to be the top number and they have to add to be the bottom number. So let's talk about whether those factors should be positive or negative or one of each. So if our top number of our X puzzle is positive, then that means that we are going to have one of two cases. If our top number is positive, then we need to look at our bottom number and determine if it is positive or negative. If it's positive, then that means that we must have two positive numbers, because two positive numbers will multiply to be a positive and they will add to be a positive as well. If our bottom number is negative, then that means that both of our factors, m and n, must have been negative, because two negatives will multiply together to be a positive, but they will add to be a negative number. If, on the other hand, we have a top number that is negative, then looking at our bottom number, if it's positive, we know we have one of each. We're going to have a positive and a negative, because that's the only way that two things can multiply together and be negative, is if one of them is negative and one is positive. But the bigger one of those must be a positive number, so that's why we've got a great old big positive sign. It's the bigger number, and the negative one goes on the smaller number or the smaller factor. If our bottom number is negative, then the opposite is true. We have a bigger negative number and a smaller positive number. Let's look at the steps to factoring using our Xbox method. The very first thing before we even set up an X puzzle is to ask if there is a greatest common factor and divide that out if there is. Second is to identify our values of a, b, and c using the format above here, ax squared plus bx plus c. And go ahead and write a times c, whatever that number is, right here in the top, and write the value of b down in the bottom. We want to then find factors m and n that go on the sides of the X puzzle. In order to think of factors that multiply to be that a times c number, but add to be the bottom number, the b, we can use a T-chart to list those factor possibilities. After we do that, we're going to set up our box in order to do the second step of the X box method. Our box uses our first term, our ax squared, in the upper left, our last term, c, in the lower right. Our bx, that middle term, is going to be split up into two things, our m and n factors. So these are the factors that we got out of our X puzzle. And once we set this box up, we are going to take the GCF, the greatest common factor, of each row and each column of the box. The very important thing to remember is that the greatest common factor must take on the sign of the square that it's directly next to. And we'll look at that in the examples. And then finally, we'll be able to write our factored form, remembering to bring down that greatest common factor if there was one that you pulled out at the beginning.